So we're going to be focusing on how to take the gold standard PBL elements that John discussed in his presentation and think about how we can apply them in a world language context and what a world language context can add to PBL. This particular presentation is going to focus on three things. Number one, why PBL, particularly gold standard PBL, is such a powerful framework for helping language teachers to develop linguistic proficiency, intercultural competence, and 21st century career skills. We'll talk a little bit about how you can locate and develop project ideas that are meaningful, motivating, and moving. And we will look at a process that you might be able to use to help you craft a more powerful driving question. When we think about project-based learning versus project-based language learning, one of the primary things that language teachers need to think about is how we're going to use the project-based context or approach to help us to achieve our ultimate goal, which is, of course, the supporting learners in achieving the world readiness standards for language learning, and ultimately in developing high levels of proficiency and intercultural competence. One of the beautiful things about gold standard PBL is that it provides a really useful framework that helps us to make, in some ways, more concrete the world readiness standards, and also that enables us to integrate the world readiness standards in a way that is meaningful to students. More specifically, it helps us to take multiple aspects of proficiency, the language, cultural understandings, disciplinary content, different pieces that students need in order to achieve high levels of proficiency, and it helps us to integrate those into a single powerful pathway to proficiency. And it does that by connecting students with authentic audiences for authentic purposes. And this is one of the places where world language education has a real advantage, because we have spent so much time thinking about authenticity in terms of cultural authenticity. And so we have target language communities that we want our students to be able to interact with, which provides our students with automatic access to a lot of authentic audiences. If we are thoughtful about how we integrate our curriculum with PBL, we can position ourselves also to help students find authentic purposes for their language learning. And that is one of the real strengths of integrating career pathways into our projects, which is something that we'll be focusing on later in later modules of this online institute. So for language teachers, one of the things that we need to really think about is, John mentioned dessert projects versus main course projects. And I want to give you some examples of what that might look like in a world language context. So a lot of teachers might do things, particularly in younger grades, like making a piñata, which is theoretically a hands-on project with some measure of cultural relevance, but it doesn't develop language skills, although I suppose it could, depending on how it's set up. And so one of the things that we want to ask ourselves as we're evaluating what we're already doing in our classrooms is how essential are the 5 C's from the World Readiness Standards and the 21st century skills from the Actful 21st Century Skills Map to the completion of the project. Are students having to collaborate? Are they having to use their language to communicate in order to accomplish the project tasks? Are they developing or using technological literacy skills? Are they developing initiative and responsibility and accountability and leadership? So those are some of the kinds of things we want to think about as we look through or review our existing curriculum and the projects that we may be doing in our classes. Another typical set of projects would be things like making a menu or creating a fashion show. These would be really good examples of dessert projects in a foreign language context, not because they're bad projects. In these two examples, students are actually using their language skills practicing the grammatical function or the communicative functions that we want students to be learning. However, they're not doing it necessarily for an authentic audience or for a real world purpose. So these are simulated encounters that don't actually give them opportunities to interact with target languages or with the target culture. Things like producing a class newspaper might, depending on how it's structured, move toward more of a main course project. But once again, we need to be thinking about authentic audiences. We need to be thinking about how we're carefully, thoughtfully developing students' proficiency. But when we look at a project like something that meets the gold standard, then students are collaborating to investigate a particular issue and to develop some sort of public product for a public audience. So what constitutes a good project essentially depends on what our ultimate goal is. And some projects are going to do a better job of building proficiency than others. And so I think it's really important, particularly for people who are just starting with project-based language learning, that you keep in mind that your development as a project-based language learning teacher is going to be progressive. And you're going to need to start where you are and figure out what is your very next step. So it may not make sense for you to try to tackle some of the things that I'm going to be suggesting later in this particular segment of the webinar. Take where you're at and say, how can I add one more C? How can I make this just a little bit more student-centered? How can I focus a little bit more on using the learner as the, or not using, but on engaging the learner as a doer and creator, and use the language as a vehicle for engaging the learner with the world. So we're going to do a very quick review of some of the things that John mentioned, but in a world language, from a world language perspective. When you look at these three vehicles, they are all quite different, and yet they all have a lot of things that are in common. And the same is going to be true of projects, even effective gold standard quality projects that we might do in a world language setting. So we're going to kind of play with this analogy for a little bit. The first thing that good language projects need is a powerful engine. And that is something that gold standard PBL provides in a world language context. This idea that we really should be organizing our curriculum around challenging problems or questions. PBLL requires rich fuel, so students need a meaningful purpose for doing what we're asking them to do. And the idea that you'll use this someday, or this is a good job skill to have, is not as powerful a motivator for a lot of students as working on something that they know is really going to make a difference in the real world. And if you look at sort of the fuel gauge here, each of these items can really help us to deepen the richness of the projects that we're asking students to work on and the ways that we're asking students to use language. So it's absolutely essential that students have grammar and vocabulary. And one of the things that a lot of teachers worry about is, well, what happens to the grammar and vocabulary? That part is still a part of the project, but it no longer gets to be the focus of the project. Instead, the focus of the project is that we're using or mobilizing that grammar and vocabulary as fuel to take us somewhere. And part of where we might want to go is so that we can talk about things that happen in the real world, different global issues. Part of what we might want to use that fuel for is to take us places that allow us to start engaging in meaningful ways with target cultures. Part of what we need in terms of the fuel is opportunities to think critically about our engagement with those cultures, which is one of the key pieces that we need in order to develop intercultural competence. In other words, we want students to be using their grammar and vocabulary for communicative purposes. And the more we can think about incorporating 21st century skills, the more likely it is that the tasks that we are giving students to do will help them to accomplish that. So when we look at gold standard PBL and think about it in a PBLL context, with the last L being the language piece, project-based language learning, those essential project design elements can really start helping us in much the same way that steering wheel would help us in a car. Just as a new driver very quickly learns that it's not a good idea to make dramatic course corrections by jerking the steering wheel one way or the other in order to move in a particular direction, project-based language learning teachers start to realize that each of the project design elements are things that we want to pay attention to and use to help us make tiny course corrections in our projects. So depending on what our particular project is, maybe we have been very teacher focused in the project. And so we might want to look for opportunities for students to start generating more questions, which, by the way, is a key piece of what they need to be able to do on their own in order to improve their proficiency. Getting to the point where they can ask questions and participate more fully in conversations is going to be a key piece for them. Maybe we need to add a little more voice and choice. Maybe we haven't built in enough opportunities for students to receive feedback about their language use. So each of these gold standard elements can help us refine our projects as we're developing them. Useful projects help students to fulfill a real world purpose. And in language learning, we need to keep forefront in our minds the idea that proficiency is our purpose, the development of proficiency and intercultural competence. And so we want to make sure that we have adequate opportunities to get feedback about students' proficiency development. So the project tasks in which they're engaged should give us opportunities to see to what extent are they able to interpret the information that they encounter in the interpretive mode. So can they read, listen to, view, or understand things that target language speakers say to them or that they are encountering in terms of culturally authentic materials as they're gathering information that will help them. We want to think about community partners, and this is another place where world language teachers have a tremendous advantage because A, we have contacts around the world, most language teachers do, and we have the linguistic skills and the intercultural competence to be able to really develop relationships with partners around the world as well as in our own local communities. We're going to kind of skip through these because these are basically a summary of much of what you've already talked about with John. And we're going to move to how do projects kind of fall apart in a world language context and what can we do about that. So there are a number of ways that projects fall apart as we are designing them. Sometimes we forget that the purpose is proficiency. So two questions you can ask yourself as you're developing your project are A, does the project naturally generate a need to communicate? And does the project require communication across all three modes? So a lot of language teachers are great at generating ideas for projects that require communication in the presentational mode, where students are going to present something to somebody else. One of the things we need to be very careful about as language teachers when we start integrating project-based language learning into our curriculum is thinking about how we can focus on giving students opportunities to communicate in the interpersonal mode. How can we use the project as a vehicle for giving them opportunities to engage with target language speakers? Sometimes we forget that culture is really important. So we're great at generating projects that are completely devoid of a cultural context. So as you're thinking about project ideas, I would really encourage you not only to think about, okay, how could I connect this to the culture? But think about how you could use the project as an opportunity to start developing students' intercultural skills. Specifically, does your project engage students in observing, reflecting, and interacting with the culture? Does it engage students in comparing and contrasting things from the target culture with things from their own lives? Does it engage them in critically interpreting their cultural encounters? Does it give them opportunities to become better learners of culture, which is quite different from teaching culture? And a lot of times as teachers, we think, okay, I'll generate a project where I will teach students something about the culture. And I guess what I'm advocating here is that we use project-based language learning as a framework for helping us to help students learn to engage with the culture or the target culture in ways that help them to become better learners of culture. Sometimes we forget that there is other content besides the grammar and vocabulary of our language. Students need something to talk about, and the opportunity to explore other disciplines and to think about how they might navigate problems is a really powerful motivator for language use. So when we are thinking about developing our projects, we want to make sure that what we're asking students to do requires them to acquire and interpret information using the target language. We want the project to motivate students to go out and seek information from other disciplines in order to accomplish project tasks. And inviting students to investigate career pathways that they care about is one way that we can help them to accomplish that. We want to make sure they have opportunities to compare and contrast. And we'll talk a lot more about this in the modules on interculturality that are coming up in future sessions. And we want to make sure that they have opportunities to engage in target language use in the community, whether that's our local community or communities of target language speakers in other countries. And as they're engaging in that, we want it to be for authentic, real-life purposes. And this is the place where I think that world language education can learn a lot from PBL. So somebody mentioned in the chat earlier, what do we mean by authenticity? And I would suggest that the more authentic, they mentioned points of authenticity. If we can get students using the target language for authentic purposes, meaning real world purposes, using culturally authentic materials, engaging with native speakers in culturally authentic places. In other words, the more points of authenticity our project touches, the more powerful the project is likely to be. So in other words, successful project-based language learning is going to incorporate as many of the 21st century skills as we can. And as a novice project-based language learning teacher, maybe all you can manage in your first project is to incorporate 1 or 2 skills. And the more skilled you become at thinking about how those skills can be integrated into your projects, the more proficient you'll become at integrating more opportunities to develop additional skills. So where can we find good project ideas for the world language classroom? The short answer is that they are everywhere. Primarily what we're looking for are things that are going to cognitively challenge our learners, whatever age they are at, things that are emotionally engaging, socially satisfying, and personally empowering. And those are the kinds of contexts that move us. Those are the kinds of contexts that are meaningful and motivating. And those are the kinds of contexts that ultimately transform us, that help change who we are and help change the world. And ultimately, that is what hopefully our language learning experiences as we explore the world do for us when we engage with other cultures, is they transform us in the way that we view the world, and they transform our ability to contribute to the world. So where do we find these ideas? There are lots of easy ways. First of all, just noticing problems and possibilities. What concerns, interests, or intrigues you? And then start thinking about what might concern, interest, or intrigue your students. Is there anything going on in your local school community or your nation, or the nation, or the world that might be of interest or worth exploring? Ask your students, What is it that your students are talking about? What are their interests? What are their hobbies? What do they think about? What do they worry about? What do they care about? Those are the kinds of things that are going to point you in the direction of a really powerful project topic idea and driving question. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but I will post the links for this in the module so that you can read these. I think it's really important to remember that even very young learners, many young learners, are already doing amazing things. And so I think as language teachers, sometimes we think, well, I don't have the expertise to guide them in this, and I don't know anything about all of these other areas in the world, and so we're just going to stick to focusing on language. Or they say, well, my learners don't have very much language, so therefore we can't do any of these things. We're going to address in a very detailed fashion how you can scaffold language for students. In fact, we've set aside 4 separate modules to help you think more carefully about that. So my advice to you at this early stage is don't worry about the language, which sounds kind of heretical. We can help you to break down the language in ways that will make it possible for your learners to do what they need to do. What you need to worry about right now is generating an intriguing project that learners would truly be motivated to participate in. One thing that you can do to help you with that is to figure out where you want to go with the project once you have a project topic. And a driving question can help you sort of give you a destination for where you're headed. So what we're going to think about now is what the components of a driving question are for a world language classroom, and a process that you might use to kind of generate one. And we'll look at some example driving questions. So driving questions give direction to your project. They should evoke curiosity. So how can we paint the town hall is probably not something that evokes a whole lot of curiosity, even though it might be a real world need. So we want to start thinking about all of the different aspects of a driving question as we're crafting it. It should engage students in exploring the real world. As John mentioned, it needs to be open-ended. If it's something that you already know the answer to, it's not to say that you can't use those kinds of questions, but they're not going to be as meaningful or as motivating as a question that you are exploring jointly with your learners. It should have a lot of different possible answers that can't be Googled or found in a textbook. It should frame and bound your exploration. So I can think of project ideas that could take literally 5 years to complete. The idea behind a driving question is that it focuses our inquiry. And that's another piece that I want to really underscore, is the idea that as we're generating our project topic and our driving questions, or our challenging questions as they call them in gold standard PBLL, we want to really think about how is this question guiding, framing, bounding sustained inquiry, giving students opportunities to investigate or to seek answers to some problem or question or challenge. One way you can tell if you've got a good driving question is if it makes students bubble with more questions. When you mention the topic, does it motivate them to want to know stuff? Does it motivate them to rush out of your classroom and go explore stuff and come the next day and say, guess what I found out about such and such? Do they rush to tell you the things that they've learned? If they do, you know you're in a productive lane, so to speak. It should motivate communication. And in a world language context, and this is a key piece, we want to make sure that our driving question is going to encourage students to have opportunities to develop proficiency, which means there are a handful of communicative functions we really need to be thinking about. Can students use this? Does the driving question provide students with opportunities to describe, to narrate, to state and defend opinions, to hypothesize, or to make generalizations about the things that they're observing. And hopefully the driving question invites innovation. So what that looks like is if we take our topic from our textbook or from our AP theme, and then we start connecting it to a global issue or social problem, to a cultural context, to a career pathway, and to our learners' lives, that is a formula for generating really powerful driving questions in a world language context. When you're thinking about your topic, you want to think about it in terms of how can I take something like animals and turn it into something that is a little more interesting. And one way to do that is to think about what is the conceptual underpinning of the topic animals. So I'm going to give you some examples here. One place that we can look would be if, and I can see I have 2 slides out of order here, would be the AP themes. So when you think about global issues in the world, global challenges, science, technology, identity, family, community, most anything that's in your textbook probably fits into one of these topic areas. And within the College Board AP standard or AP curriculum frameworks, you will find more specific lists of different types of issues that would be related to each of these larger issues. And those provide great contexts for project development. The next step is that we want to connect it to a cultural context. And you can think about that in terms of what would you or your learners like to change about the world? What do you have to contribute to the world? And where do your learners' greatest joys meet the world's deepest needs? So let's look at some concrete examples. And we'll start with something that's really local and close to home. Here's a really nice way that a middle school teacher decided to engage her beginning French learners in thinking about project-based language learning. So she set up kind of a Weebly website, which I will link to so that you can go explore this. And actually their whole middle school has gone to a project-based language or project-based learning model. And the problem that she noticed was that her enrollment in her classes was declining. And so she decided to make that the subject of a project-based language learning initiative. And so you can see that her driving question is, how can initial enrollment in French classes at Hadley be increased to save the program itself and to save future higher level classes at Glenbard West High School? So she's thinking about long-term consequences of this shrinking enrollment. She provided a variety of essential questions, but you'll notice essential questions are sort of the things that language teachers would typically identify as content for students to learn. This is stuff we want to teach them or stuff we want them to walk away knowing how to do. Whereas if you look at her driving questions, these are questions that she's using to generate sustained inquiry. Why are more students taking Spanish than French? How could we convince people to take French? What are the benefits of taking French? Another example, this particular question is, how can we help the world gain a more nuanced perspective on Arab cultures? And the project overview, this one is more of a simulation, so maybe not as real world as we might like, but the simulation could provide a really unique context for inquiry. If you're going to take the role of a migrant worker or an American businessman or an Arab woman, and you're going to research the culture from that particular role, and then you're going to collaborate to think about how we can help the world gain a more nuanced perspective, we start to see a much more rich context for inquiry there. When you ask students what they would like to explore, this particular project is an example of a student who was worried about sea turtles and preserving sea turtles. And so he generated an activity book, which, as you can see from the caption here, has been translated into 5 different languages, and he has been produced over 200,000 times now, to change attitudes and perspectives of different cultures about their natural resources. So you can start to see where this might get into career pathways as well. Another challenge, how can we improve the quality of healthcare in our respective countries? So this is a photo from an excursion of Doctors Without, kind of a Doctors Without Borders sort of an organization. And a doctor came back and said, you know, the reality is I am having to send people don't have access to health care. As a result, their only access is a clinic staffed by volunteers that's only open during particular times of the year when it's not the rainy season. People are getting scratched and not knowing how to disinfect the cuts, or not knowing how to protect themselves from malaria and things like that, and their legs are having to be amputated in a variety of different things. Students also started to realize that there were lots of issues in the United States as well. And so this particular project provided students with an opportunity to start thinking about, are there ways that we could use our language skills to provide better information about basic health care in our own country and in other countries? And could we collaborate with people from both target language, or both the target language culture and our own culture, to improve access to good healthcare information?
Hi, Cherice. Just a reminder that we're getting pretty short on time.
Great. So to conclude, if you think about how you can start taking your textbook topic, organizing it by connecting it to global issues, cultural contexts, career pathways, and using those things to generate a driving question that students will care about, you can really position learners to have powerful language learning experiences. Yao is going to talk next about how you can use learning outcomes to help you to do that, to integrate those things. And I will also post this document, which is a template for language teachers to start connecting all of these pieces into a learning outcome. You might also want to look at Laura Sexton's resources. She has a lot of examples of projects she's done in level 1 classes and reflections about what has worked for her and what has not. Reality can be messy, and we know that, and so we encourage you to start exploring and see where it takes you. And thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you so much, Cherice. That is a wonderful launch for us thinking about how to apply the standards of project-based learning to our language learning context. People had some questions, but looking over them, I think that they will be addressed as we move forward in our institute. So I'm going to hand over to Yao Hill for her session. So Cherice, if you will hit the little red button that says Stop Share, then Yao, if you could share your screen and turn on your microphone.